The position of Minister for Magic is formally established in the early 18th century, following the signing of the International Statute of Secrecy. The first wizard to hold this office is Ulick Gamp, which is too close to Ulick Gramps for my liking. I mean, I'm sure most grandfathers are nice enough people, but that doesn't mean I want to know what they taste like. Anyway, Ulick Gamp was appointed in 1707. Gamp's role is less about leadership and more about damage control. His primary responsibility is enforcing secrecy between the magical and non-magical worlds at a time when wizards are still adjusting to the idea that they can no longer rule openly. This involves restructuring magical governance, coordinating with the Wizengamot, and ensuring that magical law supersedes older, feudal-style authority. One of Gamp's most lasting legacies is Gamp's Law of Elemental Transfiguration, which defines what magic fundamentally cannot do. Although the law is later refined and expanded, it begins under his administration as an attempt to impose limits on magical experimentation, largely because unregulated magic keeps causing public incidents. Wizards, left unsupervised, are not subtle, and Gamp's law was essential in making sure that they didn't go around turning muggles into frogs while conjuring 7-foot-tall hot fudge sundaes. Gamp serves for nearly 2 decades, providing stability rather than innovation. His tenure sets the template for future ministers. Bureaucratic, reactive, and permanently anxious about exposure. He does not die in office, is not overthrown, and does not spark a rebellion, which, by ministry standards, counts as a strong opening act. He also manages to serve his entire tenure without licking anyone's grandparents, much to the relief of wizards everywhere. This establishes the office of Minister for Magic and the expectations attached to it. The next significant Minister for Magic is Artemisia Lufkin, who takes office in 1798. She is one of the earliest ministers to inherit a system that actually functions, and immediately discovers how fragile it still is. Lufkin's term is defined almost entirely by containment. Her administration deals with repeated breaches of the Statute of Secrecy caused by careless magical use, rogue magical creatures, and wizards who thought conjuring 6-foot-tall hot fudge sundaes was somehow less conspicuous than the 7-foot-tall variety. Her response is not ideological. It is procedural. More paperwork, more oversight, fewer chances for individuals to, quote-unquote, handle things themselves, which had proven disastrous. And for the love of all that is magic, a complete ban on oversized frozen dairy treats. She is best remembered for strengthening cooperation between the Ministry and the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, formalizing response protocols rather than improvising them. This is the point where the Ministry shifts from a loose governing body into something recognizably bureaucratic. Wizards complain. The system survives anyway. Lufkin serves until 1811, stepping down without scandal, rebellion, or collapse. That makes her tenure quietly successful and deeply uncelebrated, which, for a Minister for Magic, is usually the goal. The next Minister for Magic is Grogan Stump, who takes office in 1811. Stump's tenure is defined by one thing: paranoia, specifically about muggles discovering magic. Stump becomes minister during a period of increasing industrialization in the muggle world. Trains, factories, and dense cities make secrecy harder to maintain. Muggles were easier to fool when they were just farm-dwelling bumpkins, but the new breed of urban muggles proves to be made of much shrewder stock. Stump reacts by tightening control. His most notable action is pushing through policies that deliberately distance wizarding society further from muggles, both socially and legally. He is best remembered for formalizing the Ministry's hostile stance toward magical creatures that cannot reliably conceal themselves, arguing that they represent an unacceptable risk to secrecy. This leads to stricter classifications and heavier regulation, especially for beings already marginalized. It is efficient. It is not humane. Stump's leadership style is rigid and defensive. Problems are not solved, they are buried. His term ends in 1819, leaving behind a ministry that is safer from exposure, but colder, narrower, and far less flexible than before. This completes Grogan Stump's tenure as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Josephina Flint, who assumes office in 1819, immediately after Grogan Stump. Her tenure is noticeable for how little she actually did, the mark of any good bureaucrat. Flint inherits a ministry that is already highly cautious, tightly regulated, and deeply risk-averse. Rather than reverse any of this, she decides, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Her administration focuses on preserving secrecy through routine, not reform. Reinforcing existing laws, standardizing enforcement, and avoiding any large-scale policy shifts. There are no major scandals, wars, or ideological battles during her time in office. Magical creatures remain heavily regulated. Relations with Muggles remain distant, and the wizarding world's grandfathers remain unlicked. The ministry functions, files are processed, and crises are handled quietly. This is governance as maintenance work. Josephina Flint serves until 1827. She leaves office without controversy, without praise, and without leaving behind any defining legacy beyond continuity. The system remains intact, which appears to have been the only objective. This completes Josephina Flint's term as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Ulick Gamp, who takes office in 1827. Her administration is remembered almost entirely for one decision, and the chaos that followed it. Gamp authorizes the legalization of broom racing, an attempt to regulate a sport that had been operating illegally for years. In theory, this brings dangerous activity under ministry oversight. In practice, it immediately creates new problems. Overcrowded events, uncontrolled spectators, and repeated breaches of the statute of secrecy as brooms become impossible to hide at scale. Legend has it, it was around this time that one unfortunate wizard attempting to hide his broom awkwardly under his robes inspired the classic joke, "Is that a broomstick in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?" Rather than improving safety, Gamble's reforms expose how unprepared the ministry is to manage wizarding leisure on a public level. Enforcement lags behind participation, and magical law is forced to react in real time. Predictably, it does not cope well. Gamp serves until 1835, stepping down after years of administrative strain caused largely by her own reforms. Her term leaves behind stricter sporting regulations and a ministry newly aware that wizarding culture, when left unchecked, becomes a logistical nightmare. This completes Ulick Gamp's tenure as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Rudolphus Lestrange, who takes office in 1835. His tenure marks a sharp shift away from administrative caution and toward authoritarian enforcement. Lestrange governs during a period of rising unrest within the wizarding world. Instead of addressing the causes, he focuses on suppression. His administration expands the powers of magical law enforcement because, as everyone knows, giving officers of the law unchecked authority always has a happy ending. Lestrange gave Aurors greater authority to detain, interrogate, and monitor witches and wizards suspected of destabilizing secrecy. Oversight is minimal. Efficiency is the priority. He is particularly aggressive in dealing with magical creatures and beings deemed non-compliant, reinforcing earlier restrictive classifications and increasing penalties for violations. You know, first they came for the house elves, and I said nothing, and all that. This creates a ministry that is powerful, feared, and increasingly disconnected from the people it governs. Lestrange's term ends in 1841. He leaves behind a ministry that functions through intimidation rather than trust. Effective in the short term, brittle in the long one. His legacy sets a precedent. When order slips, force becomes the default solution. This completes Rudolphus Lestrange's term as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Hortensia Milliford, who takes office in 1841, directly after Rudolphus Lestrange. Her appointment signals a deliberate attempt to soften the ministry's image after years of heavy-handed rule. Milliford inherits a government built on enforcement and fear. Rather than dismantling it, she reduces the pressure just enough to keep it functioning. Auror authority remains strong, but internal oversight increases. Investigations begin to require justification again, instead of Aurors just going after anyone who looks at them funny. This is not reform, it is damage control. Her administration focuses on restoring limited trust between the ministry and the wider wizarding population, particularly among those who had been targeted under Lestrange's policies. Regulations surrounding magical creatures are reviewed, though few are meaningfully changed. It's the bureaucratic equivalent of moving things around on your desk whenever the boss walks by so you look busy. The emphasis is on moderation, not reversal. Milliford serves until 1849. She is not remembered for bold leadership, but for stabilizing a system that had begun to strain under its own weight. The ministry emerges quieter, slightly less feared, and still very much in control. This completes Hortensia Milliford's term as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Millicent Bagnold, who takes office in 1980, following one of the most destabilizing periods in modern wizarding history, the 70s disco era. The First Wizarding War. Bagnold becomes minister immediately after the First Wizarding War and the apparent defeat of Lord Voldemort. Her primary responsibility is not reform or expansion, but recovery. The wizarding world is traumatized, institutions are damaged, and public trust in the ministry is extremely low after years of infiltration and fear. Her most significant decision is granting Order of Merlin first-class awards to individuals who fought against Voldemort. This is not symbolic generosity. It is an attempt to re-legitimize the ministry by aligning it publicly with resistance rather than authority. It's a way of saying retroactively, we were always on the good guy's side. Bagnold also oversees the release of several witches and wizards who were imprisoned without fair trial during the war, acknowledging, quietly, that the ministry's earlier methods caused lasting harm. Freedom is nice and all, but they could have at least sprung for some Wendy's Frosty coupons or something to compensate for the unfair jailing. She serves until 1990, leaving behind a ministry that is calmer, more trusted, and still deeply fragile beneath the surface. This completes Millicent Bagnold's term as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Cornelius Fudge, who takes office in 1990. His tenure is defined by denial at the end. Fudge inherits a wizarding world that is stable on the surface and deeply anxious underneath. Hey, as a millennial, I can relate. His leadership style prioritizes reassurance over accuracy. When problems arise, his instinct is to minimize them publicly rather than confront them directly. As long as people feel safe, he considers the job done. This approach collapses when Lord Voldemort returns. Faced with evidence from Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore, Fudge decides the best course of action is to make like an ostrich and bury his head in the proverbial sand. He refuses to accept the truth, fearing mass panic and political instability. Instead of preparing the wizarding world, he launches a smear campaign, discrediting witnesses and tightening control over Hogwarts and the press. Under Fudge, the ministry actively interferes with education, installs Dolores Umbridge at Hogwarts, suppresses dissent, and manipulates public information. If I didn't know better, I'd assume Fudge was on Voldemort's payroll himself. These actions do not prevent Voldemort's rise. Duh. They instead delay recognition of it, making the eventual consequences far worse. Double duh. Fudge is removed from office in 1996, once Voldemort's return becomes undeniable. His tenure leaves the ministry weakened, mistrusted, and unprepared for the war it now must fight. This completes Cornelius Fudge's term as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Rufus Scrimgeour, who takes office in 1996, immediately after Cornelius Fudge's removal. Unlike his predecessor, Scrimgeour does not deny reality. He accepts it, and then screws the pooch from a completely different angle. Scrimgeour is a former head of the Auror office, and he governs like one. His ministry treats the return of Lord Voldemort as a military problem rather than a social one. Security is tightened, arrests increase, and the wizarding world is placed under constant surveillance. Technically, this is sensible. Practically, it erodes public trust even further. His most damaging mistake is attempting to use Harry Potter as a symbol. Not only is Harry's silhouette nowhere near as cool as the bat symbol or Superman's S shield, but the Potter signal Scrimgeour puts on the roof of the Ministry of Magic just looked tacky. Scrimgeour repeatedly pressures Harry to publicly endorse the ministry, hoping to borrow credibility rather than earn it. Harry responds by telling him to consume a satchel of Richards. This leaves Scrimgeour fighting a war without the one figure the public actually believes in. Despite this, Scrimgeour is not incompetent. He resists Death Eater influence, refuses to cooperate with Voldemort, and protects ministry secrets even under torture. When the ministry falls in 1997, Scrimgeour is arrested, tortured, and murdered for refusing to reveal Harry's location. His death marks the final collapse of the ministry as an independent governing body. This completes Rufus Scrimgeour's term as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Pius Thicknesse, who takes office in 1997, after the fall of Rufus Scrimgeour. On paper, Thicknesse is the legal successor. In reality, he is already compromised before his appointment. Thicknesse is placed under the Imperious Curse by Death Eaters prior to becoming minister. His rise is not the result of policy or public trust, but coercion. From the moment he takes office, the ministry is no longer an independent authority. It is an occupied institution. I guess you could say the ministry was down with the Thicknesse. Under Thicknesse, the ministry became an enforcement arm of Voldemort's regime. Muggle-born registration commissions are established, stripping witches and wizards of rights based solely on ancestry. Propaganda replaces information. Trials become formalities. Cats and dogs living together. Mass hysteria. The appearance of law is maintained, but the outcome is predetermined. Although Thicknesse signs decrees and gives orders, none of them originate with him. Every major decision is dictated by Voldemort and carried out by Death Eaters operating openly within the Ministry. Thicknesse's role is to legitimize control, not to exercise it. His tenure ends in 1998, when Voldemort is defeated and the Imperius Curse is lifted. Thicknesse survives the war and is removed from office. He is not celebrated, imprisoned, or executed. He is remembered as the minister who proved how easily the system could be taken over without dismantling it. This completes Pius Thicknesse's term as Minister for Magic. The next Minister for Magic is Kingsley Shacklebolt, who takes office in 1998, immediately after the defeat of Lord Voldemort. His appointment is not the result of campaigning or political maneuvering, but DEI. Just kidding, it's a response to collapse. Shacklebolt inherits a ministry that has been infiltrated, weaponized, and publicly exposed as corruptible. His first priority is restoration, not reinvention. Death Eater influence is purged from the ministry. Unjust laws are repealed, and imprisoned witches and wizards who were targeted under the previous regime are released. Sadly, once again, the ministry fails to offer them any ice cream coupons to ease the pain of false imprisonment. The emphasis is legitimacy. The law must visibly mean something again. Unlike previous ministers, Shacklebolt governs with transparency. He openly acknowledges the ministry's failures during both Wizarding Wars and works closely with figures who previously operated outside official authority, including members of the Order of the Phoenix. This is not generosity. It is recognition that isolation nearly destroyed the system. One of his most significant reforms is restructuring Azkaban, removing Dementors from control of the prison entirely. Personally, I think the quote-unquote good guys should have eliminated evil soul-sucking wraiths from their prisons long before that, but I guess better late than never. This ends centuries of state-sanctioned psychological torture and marks a clear shift away from fear-based governance. Aurora authority remains strong, but oversight is restored. Shacklebolt continues as minister beyond the immediate post-war period, becoming one of the longest-serving modern ministers for magic. His legacy is not spectacle or ideology, but stability, achieved by accepting that power only works when it is accountable. This completes Kingsley Shacklebolt's term as Minister for Magic. After the Second Wizarding War, Hermione Granger becomes one of the most influential figures inside the restructured Ministry of Magic, despite never seeking public leadership or symbolic authority. Hermione joins the ministry during Kingsley Shacklebolt's reform period, entering a system that is actively dismantling laws created to enforce blood purity, discrimination, and authoritarian control. Unlike many wartime heroes, she does not operate from the outside or through legacy status. She works within the bureaucracy, where the damage was actually done. She quickly rises to become one of the ministry's most effective policy architects, particularly in areas involving magical law reform and civil rights. Hermione plays a direct role in identifying, repealing, and replacing legislation introduced under Voldemort's regime, including statutes that criminalized Muggle-born witches and wizards or restricted their access to education, employment, and legal protection, as well as eliminating the Dark Lord's most controversial directive, the one that commands wizards to lick as many grandpas as physically possible. Ha! Bet you weren't expecting me to bring it back. Her approach is methodical rather than ideological. Hermione does not argue abstract morality. She dismantles laws line by line, exposes contradictions, and forces legal accountability through precedent. This is the same skill set the former book-obsessed nerd used at Hogwarts, now applied at scale. The difference is that mistakes now affect an entire population. Hermione becomes known inside the ministry as a progressive but relentless voice, pushing reforms faster than many senior officials are comfortable with. Resistance exists, particularly from long-standing bureaucrats who benefited from the old systems. But Hermione's authority comes from documentation, not reputation. She makes it harder to argue than to comply. Her work ensures that post-war Wizarding Britain does not simply return to its previous norms, but actively removes structural mechanisms that allowed oppression to exist in the first place. By the time her influence is fully established, pro-pureblood law is no longer quietly tolerated. It is legally impossible. Hermione helps rebuild the system, but the system she's fixing was shaped by something much older. Because long before corrupt laws and failed ministers, Wizarding Britain was quietly run by bloodlines, a closed circle of families deciding who mattered, who belonged, and who didn't, on paper, in law, and behind the scenes. So next, we're stepping back to the source. All 28 sacred pureblood families in Harry Potter explained in full detail.